We got through Genesis. We've covered everything there is to be said about it. So we move on. And here it is, the moment I know you've all been waiting for, the moment in the class when I tell you that the Exodus didn't really happen. You ready? Claire, was that you? No. It was you. The Exodus didn't happen. Or at least, right, it didn't happen the way it's portrayed in the Bible, or, as I always want to make sure, the ways it's portrayed in the Bible. And the proof of this, such as there is the lack of evidence, right? There are no Egyptian records of the mass enslavement of a foreign population. There are no Egyptian records of the mass exodus of an enslaved population. There are no Egyptian records of the population-wide death of the firstborn. There are no Egyptian records of Pharaoh and his army being drowned. The Bible tells us that 600,000 men, and if we count women and children, everyone estimates that to be closer to 2 million people, 2.5 million people, left Egypt and crossed the wilderness. You'd think that would leave a mark or 1 million marks, but there is no archaeological evidence for that either. And I'm not even going to get into the feasibility of that many people moving together. Nor am I going to get into the chronological difficulties, like the fact that the Exodus is said to have lasted for 400 years, or 430, depending on which text you read. But Moses is supposed to be the 4th generation after Levi, who died before the Israelites were even enslaved. In short, from the perspective of archaeology and the Egyptian record and internal logic of the biblical account, it just didn't happen. Goodbye. No, okay. On the other hand, that feels like enough for one day. On the other hand, is the Exodus story complete fiction? Right? We might understand it if a people invented a story, say, about how their long ago ancestors received a divine promise of the land. That's a story I can imagine somebody making up. Or I can imagine somebody making up a story about how their ancestors conquered the entire land of Canaan with trumpets. Like, I can understand those as stories. Can you imagine a people inventing a story in which their main claim to fame was having been enslaved? Is that the kind of thing that you come up with out of nowhere? Is that where you would start if you were making up a history of your own people? So perhaps we should consider the possibility that there may be something like historical truth behind the story. Maybe we should just ask that historical truth not be identical with what the Bible says. Right? So what do we know? Here's what we know. It's not going to be that much, but here it is. There were Semitic slaves in Egypt, just like there were many foreigners who were put to work. This is an image from an Egyptian tomb from the 15th century BCE. And the Semitic peoples are identifiable here by their distinctive hairstyle. I was going to make a joke about it, the ancient Egyptian equivalent of the Jufro, but I'm not sure that that's going to go over so well here. Too late now. Okay. And we know that occasionally some of these slaves escaped. This is an Egyptian papyrus from the 13th century BCE. And you can see here it's a person saying, right, like, I was sent to follow after these two escaped slaves, and I came to this fortress, and they told me they'd passed by, and they said they were going this way, and tell me what happened, right? So this is somebody who's tracking down runaway slaves. So we know that there were enslaved Semitic peoples. We know that sometimes slaves escaped. And being Semitic, the likelihood is that they would have escaped up to the north, towards Canaan, or beyond. And perhaps, and here we enter the realm of speculation, perhaps one or more of those small groups of escaped Semitic slaves joined up with the early Israelite people in Canaan, the folks who were telling stories about how our ancestors settled here because God gave them the land. And these escaped slaves brought with them the story of their escape. And maybe they gilded the story a little bit in the telling. Right? And so when this Egyptian group, or this Egypt group, joined the Canaanite groups, their stories, their traditions, would have been amalgamated with those that already existed. Thus, the story of the escape from Egypt would have been incorporated into the larger national narrative of the Israelite people, even if most of those people had never experienced such a thing. And again, this is the kind of thing that I think many of us as modern-day Americans understand. I celebrate Thanksgiving, right? I would guess that a very small percentage of the people in the room who celebrate Thanksgiving had ancestors who were at the first Thanksgiving, right? It's become our national story, right? We've picked it up. Right, the tradition of escaping slavery in Egypt is like, it's a way better story than the patriarchal story, right? It's loaded with all of these terrific themes of redemption and perseverance, and has battles in it and all that. And this tradition became a central part of the communal story of Israel. And it's also nicely applicable to anyone, right? It's not geographically located or tied to any particular ancestor. Everyone can sort of claim part of it, as of course we all still do. So the power of the story, right, which is a power, again, that we still sort of know and appreciate today, would have been felt back then also. It's clear from the number of times the Exodus story is alluded to or referred to in the Bible itself, far more than the patriarchal accounts, for example. Right? So its power would have felt back then. Its theological ramifications would have been felt back then. So we're not talking here about the literal truth of the entirety of Israel escaping from slavery. We're not even really talking about the literal truth of even a small band of Semitic peoples escaping from slavery. We're talking about the universal applicability of the story as a story. I'll get back to that a little bit. But I'm going to back up a bit first. Before we get to the Exodus, the departure, we need to talk about Moses. And specifically, I want to talk about Moses and his encounter with God. And again, as always, it's better to say encounters with God, because Moses and God have two pretty significant chats here at the beginning of our book of Exodus. In Exodus 3, Moses wants to know God's name. When I go to the Israelites and say, you know, God of your father sent me, and they say, oh yeah, what's his name? What do I tell him? And God tells him, Ehyeh asher ehyeh, to which Moses undoubtedly was like, thanks a lot. Right? This is the phrase that is often translated something like, I will be what I will be, or I am who I am. Right? You cannot, maybe you can't imagine, the amount of theological weight that is loaded onto this single verse, right? As if this is like the pinnacle of the divine revelation of like God's identity. Like, it's one verse, and, you know, to my eye at least, it's like God is kind of like playing with Moses a little bit. It's like, it's a little bit teasing. It's like, you know, what's my name? Like, yeah, like, I'll whatever I want it to be. It'll be what it'll be. I'll be who I am. And like, we give all this weight to it, like, this is the thing. But in the very, very next verse, God says, so tell him Yahweh's my name. Like, it doesn't pretend that Ehyeh asher ehyeh is actually a name, right? He says what his name is, right? My name is Yahweh. That's what you're going to call me from now on. Right? That's my name forever. So, you know, as we think about the Ehyeh asher ehyeh thing, and as you see people, right, really like leaning into that as a meaningful thing, like, just remember that it has a context, and the context is, you know, in the next breath, God's like, nah, seriously though, Yahweh's fine. So, you know, it's not that it's not meaningful, it's just maybe not the end of everything. Okay, so there's that moment. And then, a couple of chapters later, in Exodus 6, God speaks to Moses and says, I am Yahweh, right? Just comes right out and says it, which Moses would be like, yep, we went over that already, which is like a common refrain, I think. And then God goes on to say, my name is Yahweh, but I haven't been using that name up till now. Right? I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai. I didn't tell them my name was Yahweh. So we have two stories about Moses learning God's true name. both of which make it seem as if this is the first time Moses has heard this, or even actually encountered God at all. Right? When God shows up and says, "I'm Yahweh," right? That's like an introductory speech. And of course, you should have figured out by this point that this kind of thing usually indicates multiple sources, as do the different colors that I put on the screen. But this particular doublet is actually really important because it tells us something about the past, I think. According to both of these stories, God hasn't been known as Yahweh until now. So what was he called? According to the first story in Exodus 3, he was known as the God of your fathers. Right? Yahweh, the God of your fathers. Right? This is Moses. God says to Moses, here's what you tell them. Say, Yahweh, whom you know as the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has sent me to you. And that's his name, Yahweh. And this claim is, in fact, affirmed by what we find in the rest of the green/E stories. Right? The God of my father, the God of my father, the God of his father. Right? That's the language that E's characters use when they refer to the deity in Genesis. And according to Exodus 6, he says, I was known as El Shaddai. And, shockingly, that's precisely what he's called in P. Right? Introduces himself, I am El Shaddai. He's blessed as that. May El Shaddai bless you. God says, I am El Shaddai. El Shaddai appeared to me. So, right, in E and in P, before this moment, God isn't called Yahweh. Okay, well, what about J? Well, according to J, as I've shown you before, people have been invoking God's name as Yahweh since the very beginning. So this gets to the heart of one of the major source-critical questions. I've referred to it already. For generations of scholarship, it's been recognized that the use of the divine names in Genesis is a marker of the different sources. J uses Yahweh, and E and P don't. But we need to recognize that this isn't just a matter of like literary style. That's not the category we're talking about here. It's not the author of J likes the name Yahweh and the authors of E and P don't for Genesis. Right? The sources are making historical narrative claims about when the Israelites learned God's true name. Right? The patriarchs don't use Yahweh in E and P, not because the author doesn't like using that name or avoids it, but because according to the author, the characters didn't know it. And what's more, the narrator in E and in P can, of course, use the name. Like, it's not like P didn't know that El Shaddai was going to become Yahweh eventually in his story. It's just the characters don't. Right? The characters can't use it because the author says they don't know it yet. So the key thing here, as I've said before, is the alternation in the divine names in Genesis and Genesis alone isn't a stylistic thing. It's a matter of narrative claim. Okay, I'm going to do a brief aside here of something that I thinking about recently. One of the things, talking about these divine names, and I am not going to get into great depth here, but right, Elohim, God, for which the E source is named, right, the Elohistic source. Elohim, the word God, is not a name, right? Elohim is a title, right? So when they see, God did this, it's like saying the king did this, right? It's not, nobody's name is Elohim. It's a title. Yahweh is a name, right? It's a personal name, right? It is the equivalent, Yahweh is the name of Israel's God, the same way that Chemosh is the name of Moab's God, and Milcom is the name of Ammon's God, right? And Baal is the name of the Canaanites' God, one of them. And I bring this up first for clarity, and also to point out that this is a thing that is a really prominent issue that is lost in translation. When you read your Bible and Yahweh, the personal name of the deity, is translated everywhere as the Lord, right, which is decidedly not anyone's personal name, right? We lose the immediacy and the personal nature of that word, right? Right? The Lord said is the equivalent of God said. It's not the equivalent of Yahweh said. Right? So when you see the Lord in your Bibles, I want you to imagine translating that back into the personal name, right? Because that's meaningful, right? It's meaningful when the text says something like, I am the Lord who took you out of Egypt. Right? That's different from, I am Yahweh, your God, who took you out of Egypt. Right? There's an identification that comes with the name. And not just an identification, but a specification rather than a universalization. Right? I am the Lord who did whatever, right, makes it sound as if the Bible is giving us like a monotheistic statement about the one God, right? The Lord who did this. But I am Yahweh, your God, who took you out of Egypt, which deity am I? I am this deity. I am the one who did this for you. Right? It's a very different valence, and so it's just a thing to keep in mind. While I'm here, because I don't think I'm going to talk about this at any point now, at any point coming up, I might as well get the bit out of the way where I talk about the silliness of the word Jehovah. Right? Now, I mean to insult no one's faith or faith traditions. I simply want to point out where that comes from. And I'm going to do it without slides because this is not in part of my prepared presentation here. But the biblical text, right? Remember I told you the first day, the Hebrew comes in consonants originally, and then they added vowels in. Right? By the time they added the vowels into the consonantal text, it was already traditional not to pronounce the divine name, Yahweh. Right? And instead, and this ties in with what I just said, instead, in Jewish tradition, from antiquity to the present, whenever you see the name Yahweh, you are supposed to say the Hebrew word Adonai, which is Lord, right? Which is how we ended up with, right, with that translation as standard. And so when they came to put the vowels in for the word, for the divine name, they didn't put in the vowels of the divine name, Yahweh. Right? What they put in was the vowels of the word that they want you to say, which is Adonai. The vowels, you need a little bit of like tweaking, which has to do with internal Hebrew stuff, it's not important, but the vowels of Adonai are the vowels of Yehovah. Right? So they put in the vowels that come out sounding like o, ah, under the divine name Yahweh, so that somebody reading it was supposed to know to say Adonai, but people who read it and didn't know that, non-Jews, right, looked at it and said, oh, Jehovah, Yehovah. And that's how we ended up with the word Jehovah as like a name for God. Right? In other words, it is simply a fundamental misunderstanding of how the Jewish scribes were vocalizing their sacred text. Right? There's nothing authentic about the name Jehovah. It's just like it's a misunderstanding on the part of folks who were at the time, and at the time I mean for about 1,500 years between 0 and 1,500 or so, ignoring all things Jewish. Okay, that's that. Sidebar over. Now, how is it, back to this, how is it that both E and P think that Yahweh's name was revealed only at the time of Moses? Right? Why is this significant? Why even consider this to be the case? And again, as so often, we are in a land of speculation, but we might speculate that what we have here is something like a very subtle record of the development of Israelite religion. Not that there was a person named Moses who learned the true name of Yahweh, but that perhaps the group that came out of Egypt, the group who claimed Moses as their great leader, as opposed to a group that claimed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as their great leaders, right? Perhaps this group that came out of Egypt was the group that introduced the worship of Yahweh to the proto-Israelites in Canaan. Remember, these people in Canaan worshiping the deities of their patriarchal clan, right? The God of their fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac. And they're often using, right, the name of the god El, right? A Canaanite deity. the El of Abraham, the El, even maybe sometimes the Baal, right? The God of my ancestors, right? So here we can see in Genesis 31, right? This is Jacob and Laban having a chat, and may the God of Abraham and the God of Nahor, God of Abraham is obviously Jacob's ancestral deity. The God of Nahor is Laban's ancestral deity, right? It even says they're ancestral deities, right? May these gods judge between us. So the people in Canaan, right, the ones we associate maybe with the patriarchal traditions, they're worshiping the gods of their ancestors and they name them, right? God of Abraham. That's the name of their God. It's God of Abraham. And then these people come in from outside of Canaan with their new deity, Yahweh. And you may be like, wait, is Yahweh not a native Canaanite deity? Like, doesn't Yahweh belong to? And the answer the Bible even gives us is no. We have multiple texts that talk about Yahweh coming from the south. Yahweh came from Sinai. Yahweh came forth from Seir, right, which is Edom, which is the territory to the south. God is coming from Teman. Again, Teman is a word just for the south. Mount Paran is in the south. We have multiple biblical texts that attest to the notion that Yahweh's home, such as it is not at all in Canaan, but in the south. That is, on the route from Egypt up into Canaan. So I've got a Canaanite-based Israelites who are worshiping the God of their fathers. I've got people who are coming into and joining Israel, bringing with them a deity from outside, a southern deity named Yahweh. And again, remember, they come together and they create fictive kinship and they bring their stories together, right? And they assimilate their deities into one deity, right? And this deity gets the name Yahweh, right? The one who saved the people in the Exodus account. So now, with that in mind, think again about this revelation of the name to Moses. God says, they didn't know me as Yahweh, but that's who I am. And in light of the sort of historical reconstruction I just offered, this kind of can take on a different tone, right? You may think you're worshiping El Shaddai, or the God of your fathers. It's Yahweh, right? Like, that's the God you're in fact worshiping. I am Yahweh. That's the deity. Now, the central story in the Exodus narrative, at least the one that takes up the most room, is the plagues. Once I start talking about the central story, you should probably see where I'm going, right? The first plague that we encounter is the plague of blood. Have you ever tried reading the plague of blood carefully? You were supposed to for a day. God tells Moses, go to Pharaoh in the morning and tell him to let the people go. And tell him that what you're going to do is take your staff and hit the Nile and turn it to blood. And all the fish in the Nile are going to die. And it's going to stink. And then God tells Moses to tell Aaron to hold his arm over the waters of Egypt. Right? Not just the Nile, but like all the waters, the rivers, the canals, the ponds, everything. And they're going to turn to blood. Even the water in, like, cups. And Moses and Aaron do just what God commanded. And now we get the fulfillment of that. He lifted up the rod and struck the water. So who's the he here? He who did this, lifted up the staff and struck the water in the Nile. And, of course, the fish die and the Nile stinks. And suddenly there's blood everywhere in Egypt, after he just hit the Nile with his staff, whoever he is. And then the magicians come, the Egyptian magicians come along, and they do the same thing. Which you might think, how? And Pharaoh's heart is hardened, and Pharaoh ignores them, and the Egyptians dig around to find drinking water because the Nile stinks. Because it's full of blood. The digging is now a funny thing because the story just told us that all the water turned to blood, even the water in their drinking vessels, right? What are they digging for? Fools, right? So there are some obvious problems here, and as usual, there is a neat solution when we realize that there are two stories. In one of the stories, here it is in its entirety, in one of the stories, God tells Moses to strike the Nile with his staff, and Moses does so. Right? And the Nile stinks, and the Pharaoh thinks that it's all very silly, and the Egyptians dig around for water because the Nile, their main source of water, has been polluted with blood. Totally sensible. In the other story, God tells Moses to tell Aaron to hold his staff over the waters. And Moses and Aaron do so. What's Moses and Aaron? Moses told Aaron, and Aaron lifted his arm. And there was blood everywhere. And the magicians replicate the act, and Pharaoh's heart is hardened. And note that if the magicians replicate the act, what does that mean about this change of water to blood? It means it wasn't a lasting thing like the Nile turning to blood such that they have to go digging around. It means it was an instantaneous thing. I changed your water all to blood, and it changed right back. It's a trick. It's a cool magic trick. And so, such that the magicians can replicate it instantly right thereafter. Right? In other words, it's not the changing of water to blood in the P story, right, which you now know is red, is not a plague. No one's hurt by it. It's a magic trick. It's a show of power. That's why magicians are the opposite force here. It's just a show of power. So I'm not going to keep going through the plagues, but these two stories from J and P respectively, right, follow through the entire plagues story. And there are major differences in the two accounts, the J and P accounts of the plagues, not only in the details, but in the very intention of the plagues themselves. In the J story, Moses asks Pharaoh before every plague to let the people go so they can worship in the wilderness. Now, we should remember, because we sometimes forget, that this is a ruse. Moses and the Israelites have zero intention of worshiping in the wilderness. Right? Whether they do end up doing so or not is irrelevant. At the moment in the story, they don't know that they are ever going to. This is just a lie. Right? It's a lie to get Pharaoh to let them go so they can run. Right? Give us some time off to do this thing, and then they're going to bolt. Okay? They're not planning on coming back, and Moses knows they're not planning on coming back. But in the J story, right, Moses makes this request every time. Every plague is actually a legitimate attempt to get Pharaoh to release the Israelites. Right? Please let us go, or this terrible thing is going to happen. And then the terrible thing happens, right? And every time, Pharaoh gets closer and closer to letting them go. Right? Okay, just the men go. Okay, just the men and the women, but not the kids. Okay, all the people, but not the animals, right? He's always like negotiating a little bit and never willing to finally do it until the very end, but it's always a legitimate negotiation and attempt for release. But every time, in the end, Pharaoh is stubborn and decides against it, right? Until, of course, the death of the firstborn, when he finally sends them off. So the J account is like, it's a negotiation, it's a real attempt to sway Pharaoh, to convince him, and he won't be convinced. And it takes place over, a long series of encounters, right? The next morning he went out, then the next morning, and the next morning, and a week later, and days later. The entire P account takes place in a single day. Right? Moses comes to Pharaoh in his palace and with Aaron and stands there and just performs sign after sign. Just bam, 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 bam. I'm changing your water to blood. Here's a bunch of frogs. Here's some boils. Here's some hail. Right? Just like one after another. And notice, I didn't say Moses brings plague after plague, because in P, as I'm saying, they're not really plagues at all, nor are they called it in P. Right? They're called signs. And the signs in P are not an attempt to get Pharaoh to let the people go. In P, Moses never asks Pharaoh to let the people go. In P, even if Pharaoh wanted to let the people go, he can't. Why? Because God keeps hardening Pharaoh's heart. Now, hardening the heart is a sort of an idiom, which basically means making someone do something they don't necessarily want to do, right? Making somebody act against their inclination. Right? And we should remember, while we're at it, that in sidebar, we should remember that the biblical Hebrew word heart does not signify the seat of emotion in the Bible. It signifies the seat of the mind, right? So it's not God stiffening Pharaoh's heart like his desire. It's his mind, his intention. The word lave, heart, is a cognitive organ, not an emotional one. The emotional organ for the Bible, by the way, is the liver. Thanks. Not my joke, it's the Bible's. Okay, point is, with God hardening Pharaoh's heart, Pharaoh doesn't have free will in the priestly account. Right? God says from the beginning, I am going to harden Pharaoh's heart so that I may multiply my signs and marvels in the land of Egypt. God is using these signs in order to demonstrate his awesome power, and in the end, the Egyptians are going to get it. Both ways, right? They'll figure it out, and they're going to die, right? That's the point of the signs and the wonders in the P story. Right? There are many other distinctions between the two plagues accounts, but that's the most important one in theological terms, and actually the one that's hardest to deal with. The idea that in the priestly account, we're dealing with a pretty vindictive deity, right? One who's not trying, like, these signs are not attempts to get Pharaoh to let the people go. God's going to take Israel out whenever God wants, but God's going to make Egypt suffer first. While we're here, we can note one other fairly significant difference, which is the things themselves, right? Although they sometimes overlap, but the sources don't tell all the same plagues. In P, the signs are the staff changing to a snake, and this is clearly an old slide that I should change. It's not a snake; it's a crocodile. I don't mess with your image of what's going on here, but he throws his staff on the ground and it turns into a crocodile, not a serpent. That's a translation error of long ago, and evidently of recent vintage as well. It's the staff changing, the blood, the lice, the boils, hail, locusts, darkness, and the death of the firstborn. In J, the plagues are blood, frogs, insects, pestilence, hail, locusts, and death of the firstborn. Okay. They're not the same. They overlap occasionally, but not always. And here's an interesting tidbit. Take a look at Psalm 78. Don't do it now. Just look at the list I put on the screen. Psalm 78 also has blood, insects, frogs, locusts, hail, pestilence, and death of the firstborn, which is to say, it's awfully similar to J's list and not to P's. There are no boils here. There's no lice in Psalm, right? The things that are unique to P are not present in Psalm 78. Which is not to say that Psalm 78 was written by J, right? Or necessarily that J was like basing its history on Psalm 78, probably the other way around. But to point out that we have, in this case, internal biblical evidence for source division. That is, I have a biblical text that seems to know only one segment of a combined, blended canonical text. That's kind of interesting. And I will leave that aside for the moment. Another thought about the plagues. There is a long-standing attempt by some who wish to prove the historicity and truth of the biblical account, a long-standing attempt to show that the plagues have a basis in natural phenomena. You may be familiar with some of this. Just a few years ago, a scientific paper was published claiming that the plagues were the result of, can you guess? You should be able to guess, climate change. Right? The kind of thing you would discover only in certain periods of history, presumably. Now, there are, in fact, some Egyptian records, not all from the same place or time, but there are a variety of Egyptian texts that seem to correspond in large measure with some of the biblical plagues. Notices of, the Nile looks pretty red today, or gee whiz, there's lots of frogs in my yard, right? Like, or woof, that was a big hailstorm. Huh, Osiris? Or I don't know what a common Egyptian name is. Right? Those kinds of things. Right? We find texts that mention these sorts of things. So what do we make of this? No one, I don't think, is about to say that these records actually correspond historically with the plagues. Right? Nobody's going to say that like the letter that's like, boy, lots of locusts this morning, is supposed to be like the locusts from the biblical account. Right? But might we say that these texts are proof that such things could naturally occur, and perhaps by some like marvelous coincidence in sequence? Right? What if it was a real bad week and like they all just happened one after another? Right? If they can happen, right, that's a coincidence. Okay, I guess so. But what would we show if we could prove such a thing? That the plagues were actually a coincidence of natural phenomena, right? Is that proving the truth of the biblical account? It seems to me that that is, in fact, entirely against the biblical account. In the Bible, the plagues are the work of God. And if we ascribe them to natural phenomena, we are undoing the entire theological message of the biblical account. Right? At most, at the very most, we might say that the idea for what these plagues were, right? What would be the kind of thing that would strike Egypt? Insects, boils, locusts, right, etc. Right? The idea for what the plagues are may have been derived from some realities of Egyptian life, right? In other words, like they knew locusts were a problem in the area. Right? No one's going to have have Egypt being overrun by like moose, right? Right, because they know, right, like it would be locusts. But that's a far cry from saying that the truth of the Bible has been proven, right? The Bible is describing miracles. If they're natural phenomena, they're not miracles, right? The same thing, by the way, is true of the crossing of the sea in Exodus 14, right? It does no one any good to point out that there are some places, perhaps in the marshes of Egypt, where a wind occasionally blows and reveals the dry ground, or the tides such or whatever, like at some times of year the land is revealed, all of which are things that you see all the time, right? To talk about how it is that this could have happened, right? As if these things are proofs of the Bible's account of the Israelites crossing the sea, right? They're not, right? They are, in fact, the opposite of proofs of the historicity of the biblical account. The story of the crossing of the sea in Exodus 14 is also, by the way, if you haven't read that part of my book yet, is also a composite account of two narratives. I'm not going to go through it. Okay, that's my rant about people trying to naturalize biblical miracles. Don't do that. Okay. Now, a brief word about the Passover itself. Although it's not immediately apparent, perhaps, the Bible describes two rather distinct concepts here. And I'm not talking about two sources. Hey! I'm talking about two separate accounts or concepts of Passover, all of which are going to be coming from the priestly document. So we have, in Exodus 12, we have the laws about the first Passover in Egypt, right, the one where the firstborn actually die, right, the narrative. And this involves, right, sacrificing lamb or goat and all of the preparation for that, right. It involves the placing of blood on doorposts, right. This is all to do with, like, that first one, right. This is what happened in that historical moment. So it's sort of the story of the first Passover. And this entire rite is called the Passover sacrifice, hence the Jewish festival of Passover that commemorates this event, right? Like the moment when God doesn't kill the Israelites. Final sidebar, I don't know if it's the final one. The word in the Bible that we all translate Passover doesn't actually mean Passover, despite how nice that is for all of us today. The word Pesach, which becomes Pascha and Paschal, right, actually means protect, which isn't so different in the sense of the story, right? They put the blood on the doorposts so that, God will protect them from the angel of death, right? Okay. That's the end of that sidebar. Okay, so we have the Passover sacrifice. It involves a lamb, it involves blood, it involves protection. Fine. We also, though, have these laws about eating unleavened bread, which don't really seem to have very much connection to the Passover event itself. Right? What does eating unleavened bread have anything to do with this historical moment? Right? Anything to do with the Israelites in Egypt trying to avoid the death of their firstborn? It seems fairly unrelated. Like, what's even better, you will note the verse number here. Exodus 12:15 is when we get the law about eating unleavened bread. That is a good ways before we get the story that justifies, right, like the notion of not eating any leaven, right? Like, I'm sure you're all familiar, right? That why do we eat matzah on Passover, right? Because the Israelites didn't have time to let their dough rise. But the law about not eating leavened stuff comes before the historical thing even happened that like causes the law to the custom to come into place. And why on earth should anything here last 7 days when the Passover was one single night? And what's more, in this section of the laws, the festival isn't called Passover. It's called the Festival of Unleavened Bread. So what we have here, and I invite you to go back and briefly, it won't take very long, go back and reread Exodus 12 for a second, and you'll see that the whole text comes in chunks. You get a whole chunk about the Passover part, the lamb and the sacrifice and the blood, and then you get a whole chunk that's just about unleavened bread. It makes no mention of the Passover stuff at all. And then it switches back and forth. Really interesting. And it's all within one document. So what do we have here? What we have here is the combination in the text and in fact, in practice, of two distinct celebrations. We have the historical celebration of Passover, right, the moment in Egypt. And we have what was undoubtedly a seasonal agricultural festival of unleavened bread that coincides with, in this case, I think, the barley harvest in the spring. This is a principle that we, I think, probably all understand, or should understand, right? It's the same thing that happened when the historical celebration of the birth of Jesus coincided or was combined with the seasonal celebration of the solstice. Right? Like, we see this all over the place. Before Israel created its history, so to speak, the inhabitants of Canaan, who were, of course, almost all farmers, celebrated their various seasonal harvests, right? The agricultural moments. When do we bring in our crops? When do we harvest? When do we sow? When do we switch from the old grain to the new grain, etc.? So they long-standing agricultural celebrations. You may remember from way back in the very first class or second class, I put up like the earliest non-biblical text we have, which is this little like stone calendar of the seasons, right? Of agricultural seasons, right? This is central to their being. And when culturally they had history to celebrate too, they adapted their seasonal festivals and imbued them with historical significance. Again, in a way that should be relatively familiar to us. This is true not just for Passover, but for every major Israelite festival holiday, right? That we, certainly the biblical ones that we, connect with historical moments, all have originally agricultural, almost all have originally agricultural meanings. So again, what we have here is a biblical text that isn't standing as witness to the truth of the story it tells, the historical truth of the story it tells, but in fact is a witness to the development of Israel as a people and how they explained themselves to themselves. And here, at least, the Bible is actually very clear. Because here, for the first time, we have an explicit and repeated instruction to tell the story from generation to generation, right? Not to tell, like, right, we're not instructed to tell our children, right, like all of the historical data or the archaeological evidence, right? We are instructed to tell them the story, right? The story is who we are. The story is all, right? The story is everything. I suggest to you that story is far more important than actual history. If you were standing on the banks of the Red Sea, watching the Exodus occur, right? Watching the Israelites cross through and the Egyptians after them, if you were an eyewitness to that account, you would have no knowledge of what was happening, right? It would have no meaning, right? You wouldn't know anything more about God from watching it, right? From being a witness to it. What we know about God and the meaning we attach to this story, we know not from its historical reality, but from the story, right? From its telling, from the narrative, the way that the story is told. Okay, questions? Comments? Concerns? Yes,
Just
okay.
touching back on the translation error of turning the staff into the snake, and instead it was supposed to be a crocodile.
Yeah, yeah.
When the formerly snake, now crocodile, consumes the others, is it also consuming other crocodiles?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, they all turn their staffs into crocodiles. It's, again, it's just, it's crocodile, right? It's the same word, right? It's the same word that's used in Genesis 1 when God creates the sea monsters, the tanin, right? That's the thing that's being consumed. It's not the same word as, it's not. Earlier in the Exodus story, in Exodus 4, Moses is like, give me a sign so that the Israelites will believe me. And God's like, what's that in your hand? He's like, it's a staff. He's like, throw it on the ground. He's like, okay. And he throws it on the ground, and it becomes a snake. And Moses picks it up by the tail, and it turns back into a staff. That's a snake. This is not. It's not Moses' staff, right? Everybody combines these two things into one story, like, oh, it happened then, and now he's doing it again. It's different. It's a different person with a different staff and a different animal and a totally different, and a different miracle or a different sign for a different audience, right? Moses does the snake thing for the Israelites to prove to them that he's an actual, like, prophet of sorts. Aaron does this staff crocodile thing as part of the signs and wonders, right? Like, it's much more impressive to turn your staff into a crocodile than into a snake. I have frequently mistaken snakes for sticks and vice versa, but never a crocodile. Other thoughts? Yeah, please.
I don't know if there's like a real chronology here, but like you talked about there's a time like when it's traditional not to say Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
Is there like, and this is when that began, and that's when this ended, or is it still now, or?
Yeah. So it's the evidence we don't have like the moment when we have in writing someone being like, stop that, right? What we have is evidence as early as right, so we can see, right, they're certainly writing the name Yahweh consonantally all the way through, and indeed all the way through, right? It's in the liturgy that, medieval, like, it's still written today, consonantally. It seems already in the Dead Sea Scrolls we start to have evidence for if not a reluctance to pronounce, because the Dead Sea Scrolls doesn't have vowels either, at least a recognition that something special about it. There are some Dead Sea Scrolls where the name is written in a different script. Certainly by the time we get early rabbinic writings, so the first couple of centuries of the Common Era, we're already into a period where the name is not being pronounced. So it's somewhere in there is the answer. The Septuagint is from the 3rd century, the Greek translation, and they're already translating Yahweh as Kyrio, as Kyrios, as God, as Lord. So probably, there also. Again, this is not a kind of thing that happens by like edict from above, right? It's custom, and so it probably happened over a period of time with geographical variation, and eventually just became the thing. So Yeah, you know, as with everything else, right? To my knowledge, the like real ban on saying it belongs exclusively to traditional Judaism. I don't know that Christianity has anything like a don't say the name. I mean, Jehovah seems to be said all the time as if it's the name. Certainly, traditional Judaism firmly claims not to do it, and traditional Jews today firmly will not. Even in academic settings where it's recognized, people will refer to the Tetragrammaton or the divine name or the 4 letters, right, whatever it may be. Some of us who are not traditional Jews, you know, are traditionally minded or simply live most of our lives as Jews in the academic sphere, say it in part because that's probably what it was, but I don't know. It's you know, Yahweh is our very much accepted and best reconstruction, but it's not written anywhere, right? We don't have it anywhere. So yeah, you know, it's in different contexts, it's acceptable or unacceptable, right? I know for sure I wouldn't be saying it were I standing and lecturing in a conservative or Orthodox synagogue, right? Out of respect. But this is my space, right? This is academic space, and so I think it's and again, as I said at the time, I think it's really useful to like know and think about it as a proper name, right? It's a personal name of the deity. Okay, I'm out of time. I know there were more hands. I apologize. Save it for next time, maybe. All right, thanks everyone.